Good morning to you. It's Tuesday morning and a very, very warm welcome to Penn Vicarage. Good to see you. Thank you for being with us today for our Bible reflection, continuing our adventure through the book of Joshua, and I hope this finds you well and cheerful too. Friends, today we pick up the action, and it is action, isn't it? It's all action-packed stuff at Joshua and chapter 5. So put the glasses on. Without further ado, Joshua chapter 5, here goes. When all the kings of the Amorites beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the Israelites until they crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites a second time." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeah Haraloth. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the warriors, had died during the journey through the wilderness after they had gone out of Egypt. Although all the people that came out had been circumcised, yet all the people born on the journey through the wilderness after they come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the Israelites had travelled 40 years in the wilderness, until all the nation, the warriors who came out of Egypt, perished, not having listened to the voice of the Lord. To them, the Lord swore that he would not let them see the land that he'd sworn to their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children, whom he raised up in their place, that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised on the way. When the circumcising of all the nation was done, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I've rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month at the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. Once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" He replied, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. And he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my lord?" The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so to set the scene, as we found out in Joshua chapters 1 to 4, God had appeared to Joshua after Moses had died and told him to take the people across the river Jordan into the promised land. And that is exactly what had happened. They were told to be very bold and be strong, to listen to and obey the word of the law of God and listen to God and so on. And as I say, in yesterday's chapter, they crossed the river Jordan. God made the water stop and they passed over, and they built a memorial to that. And that was in yesterday's chapter. So today they've passed over and they've gone on to the other side. And we're picking up really what happens after that. Now, here's the interesting bit. It says at the beginning that when the local people, the people already in the land, heard that God had done this, what does it say? Their hearts melted within them and there was no longer any spirit in them. This is in verse 1, because of the Israelites. In other words, the news what God had done got out, and that it put the fear of God into the people who were in the land already. And they started to, and when they were frightened, God's done this. Oh my God, what are we up against here? And their hearts melted away and so on. Now, here's the interesting bit. Bear in mind, we were told, like it was yesterday, or it was yesterday, chapter 4, verse 13, that the Israelite people brought 40,000 men of war over with them. Surely, militarily, now was the time to go for it. They got the opposition on the back foot. They got 40,000 soldiers ready for battle. Surely, on normal run of things, now's the time. To use one of the few Latin phrases I know, carpe diem, seize the day. Surely, now would be the day to go for it. You've got the enemy on the back foot. You've got the soldiers ready. Surely, now would be the time. And yet, that's not what happens. Because remember, they were told to be bold and be strong and be courageous, but they were also told to listen to God. And what happens is three things happen instead. Firstly, they circumcise all the people in the land. It doesn't make easy reading for the male of the species, but from verses 4 to 9, they 4 to 10, 4 to 9, they circumcise the people. Now, what's this about? Well, it's about in back earlier on in the earlier chapters under Moses and so on. Circumcision was a sign that we were in the covenant, and I think what it means is they'd circumcised them all when they'd been in Egypt, but since they'd left, they hadn't done, and this was kind of to reinstate this, to remind them that we are counting into this covenant. So it's in a sense it's a sign of recommitment back into what God is doing, back into God's covenant again. I think it will be a bit like, what am I trying to say? Not having had communion for 40 years and reinstating communion again. That it's like that. It's about saying, God, you've done this, but we are in with you. So circumcision was the mark that the people were saying, we are on God's side. And so from verses 2 to 9, in the most interesting way, they were showing by doing this circumcision that they were recommitting themselves to God again. So they crossed over, they'd entered the promised land, and before they did any battles or anything like that, they could recommitted themselves to God again. And I think there's something very special in that, and I think that's what this is all about. So even though they got the enemy on the back foot, even though they got all his soldiers ready for battle, it was important to them, firstly, to recommit themselves to God. And that's what they're doing by circumcising all these people. They hadn't done it for 40 years, while they crossed the desert, but now, having got into the promised land, now is the time to go for it again. So to recommit themselves to God. That's the first thing they do before any battles take place, before they go to Jericho or anything like that. Then the next bit, they then celebrate the Passover. Again, for the first time in years, they celebrated the Passover. And again, this is interesting because the Passover was the time where there's that ceremony they do every year to remind them what God had done, to remind them that God had set them free from Egypt. And so, as they entered the promised land, as they began the the task of conquest, of conquering the land and so on, it's important for them to be reminded that it was God who set them free. How as it says, it's not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. And so before they start getting too big for the boots, before they start thinking, oh, well, aren't we powerful Israelites? Oh, haven't we done well? This, by reinstating the Passover, it's a way of reminding themselves that it was God who did this. and so they celebrate the Passover. So having got into the promised land, the first thing they do is they commit themselves to God. And in the Passover, they remind themselves that it was God who set them free and the battle belongs to the Lord. And interesting, at the beginning of this Passover, having passed over into the promised land, they don't get any manna anymore. That's what the food they had in the desert. They don't need it anymore because they're now in the land of milk and honey. They could rely on the produce of the land now. So God did not need to give them any manna anymore. So that's why the manna stopped. And then thirdly, we have this interesting encounter in verses 13 to the end, really, of Joshua's encounter with this person who's called the commander of the Lord. And this interesting encounter when Joshua says, whose side are you on, and so on. And again, it's the commander of the Lord. And the commander of the Lord reminds Joshua to remove the sandals from your feet, for where you stand is holy. Again, reminding him that that's something very similar happened to Moses at the burning bush, where Moses had to take his shoes off because the place he was standing was holy. And again, it's a reminder to Joshua that this is God's battle, and that in all the excitement, in all the things that were to go on in future, that actually this is God's battle, it's God's fight. And as God was with Moses, so God will be with him. But in all that's happening, the battle belongs to the Lord. Is it the commander of the Lord? So it's the Lord's host that we're going to do this, as we find out in Jericho in the next couple of chapters. That it's God's fight, that God will do the work. And I just think there's so much of a reminder in this chapter for us as we seek to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, in this Easter time especially, when we remember the resurrection of Jesus and so on. And I really do want to encourage our congregations at the moment to invite your friends to come to church. Pray for your friends, and things are going well at the moment. The church is growing and growing well. So do please invite your friends to come and join us. Invite your friends to come and join us on these messages, and invite your friends to come and join us at church. But as they enter the promised land, they circumcised themselves to recommit themselves to God. Then they did the Passover to remind themselves that it's God's work, that God set them free in the past. And this encounter at the end, this reminds us it's the commander of the Lord. It's God's battle. It's God's fight. And in God's strength, we will do valiantly. So there's some huge reminders in here for us. Do read the chapter again. Hope you find that helpful. God bless you. Have a lovely day. As I say, let's invite our friends to become Christians with us as well. Let's engage in God's work and God's battle, and let's recommit ourselves to Him. Let's remember what He's done for us in the past, and let's remember it's in His strength and in His might that we do what we do.